The kingdom of Hyrule holds secrets that span eons, mysteries buried beneath layers of time and legend. From the ancient bones of forgotten dragons to the whispered theories that challenge our understanding of beloved companions, these tales weave through the very fabric of existence itself. Tonight, we embark on a journey through the deeper truths of this timeless realm, exploring the shadows that linger between what we know and what we dare to imagine. In the quiet spaces of contemplation, perhaps we shall uncover the profound connections that bind all things together. In the western reaches of Hebra, where the winds carry whispers of ancient times, lies a place whose very name speaks to mysteries long buried. Dragonbone Mire stretches before the curious traveler like a testament to an age that predates memory itself, its boggy embrace cradling the skeletal remains of creatures so magnificent that their bones alone inspire awe across the centuries. These are not merely fossils scattered by chance across the landscape. The half-buried ribcage that emerges from the earth here tells a story of deliberate significance. Each curved bone, a chapter in a narrative that spans the breadth of Hyrule itself. For when we venture beyond this singular discovery, when we allow our understanding to expand across the kingdom's vast territories, we find that Dragonbone Mire is but one verse in an epic poem written in calcium and time. The desert winds of Gerudo carry similar secrets, where identical skeletal structures emerge from shifting sands like monuments to a forgotten pantheon. In the eastern reaches of Lanayru, beneath skies that have witnessed countless seasons, more of these ancient remains pierce the landscape with their silent testimony. Each discovery confirms what the careful observer begins to suspect. These are not isolated incidents, but evidence of an age when dragons ruled both earth and sky with a majesty we can scarcely comprehend. But perhaps most remarkably, the depths beneath Hyrule itself have yielded treasures that dwarf even these surface discoveries. In the shadowed realm that exists below the familiar world, we find not merely fragments, but complete skeletal remains of creatures whose scale defies immediate understanding. These dark skeletons, preserved in their subterranean chambers, reveal the true magnitude of what once was. Dragons whose length could span entire valleys, whose wingspan might have darkened the sky for miles in every direction. The positioning of these remains speaks to patterns that suggest more than random distribution. Found directly beneath the great Leviathan skeletons that mark significant locations across the surface world, these deeper discoveries hint at connections between the ancient past and the sacred present. It is as though the very geography of Hyrule was shaped by the presence of these magnificent beings, their final resting places becoming focal points for the civilizations that would follow. When we consider the sheer scale revealed by these complete specimens, we begin to grasp the true nature of what has been lost to time. The rib cages found scattered across the surface, impressive as they are, represent merely portions of these colossal beings. A single rib, towering above a traveler like a natural arch, was but one element in a framework that supported creatures of mythic proportions. The skulls, when found intact in the depths, speak to intellects and sensory capabilities that must have been as vast as their physical forms. These were not the sacred dragons that grace the skies of modern Hyrule, visible only to those blessed with heroic sight. These ancient beasts would have been apparent to all who shared their world, their presence as undeniable as the mountains themselves. They roamed freely across landscapes that knew no boundaries between regions, their migrations perhaps defining the very territories that later civilizations would claim as their own. The evidence suggests an age of abundance, when dragons numbered not in the solitary few, but in the hundreds, perhaps thousands. Their bones speak of variety as well as multitude, some built for the grace of eternal flight, others perhaps claiming dominion over particular territories or elements. The fossilized remains hint at creatures adapted to different purposes and environments, a diverse ecology of dragons that filled every conceivable niche in their ancient world. We must imagine skies filled with their forms, the thunder of their wings creating weather patterns that ancient peoples would have known as surely as they knew the changing seasons. The earth itself would have trembled beneath the footfalls of the largest among them, their passage carving channels that later civilizations might have taken for rivers or valleys of purely geological origin. Yet for all their apparent dominance, these creatures vanished from the world so completely that only their bones remained to tell their story. No tapestries from recorded history depict their living forms. No songs from the oldest traditions carry memories of their roars. Even the great calamity, devastating as it was, left more obvious traces in the cultural memory of Hyrule than this entire age of dragons. This absence from recorded history suggests an antiquity that predates even the earliest civilizations we know. These dragons ruled a Hyrule that existed before it became the kingdom we recognize, before the patterns of settlement and culture that define its known history took root. They were the sovereigns of a primordial realm, witnesses to landscapes and climate patterns that no Hylian eye has ever seen. The implications stretch beyond mere natural history into the realm of the profound. If dragons of such magnitude once claimed Hyrule as their domain, what forces could have brought about their complete disappearance? What cataclysm or gradual change could have eliminated creatures so perfectly adapted to their world that they had dominated it for what must have been eons? Perhaps most intriguingly, their legacy persists in ways both obvious and subtle. The very name of Dragon Bone Mire speaks to a cultural memory that recognizes these remains for what they are, suggesting that knowledge of their true nature has somehow survived the vast gulf of time that separates their age from ours. Someone, at some point in Hyrule's history, possessed the wisdom to identify these bones correctly and to preserve that identification in the naming of places. The bones themselves continue to serve the living world, their calcium frameworks providing material for weapons and tools crafted by the ingenious minds of contemporary creatures. Bokoblins and moblins, with their practical wisdom, have discovered that dragon bone possesses qualities that elevate their equipment beyond the ordinary. In their crude but effective craftsmanship, we see an echo of what might once have been. Entire civilizations that built their material culture around the gifts provided by these magnificent beasts. Thus, we find ourselves confronting one of environmental storytelling's most elegant examples, where the landscape itself serves as both museum and library, preserving not just the physical remains of an ancient age, but the questions that give meaning to their discovery. In the scattered bones of dragons, we read the first chapter of mysteries that will lead us ever deeper into the hidden truths of Hyrule's immeasurable past. In the misty heights where ancient sky islands once drifted like celestial vessels, the Zonai people cultivated a relationship with dragons that transcended the merely practical and entered the realm of the sacred. Their reverence for these magnificent beings permeated every aspect of their civilization, from the smallest decorative motifs carved into temple stones to the grand architectural gestures that defined their most important structures. The Zonai understood something about dragons that later civilizations would struggle to comprehend. Where other peoples might have seen merely powerful beasts to be feared or conquered, the Sky people recognized kindred spirits, beings whose mastery of the aerial realm matched their own, whose longevity echoed their own aspirations toward immortality, whose wisdom seemed to span the ages themselves. This recognition blossomed into a spiritual connection so profound that it shaped the very foundations of Zonai culture. Their architecture speaks this truth in a language of stone and symbol that requires no translation. Dragon motifs wind through their ruins like living things, carved with such precision and reverence that each scale seems to catch and hold the light of distant stars. These are not mere decorative elements, but sacred texts written in stone, prayers made manifest in the permanent medium of carved rock. The spiraling forms that characterize Zonai design echo the serpentine grace of dragons in flight, their buildings themselves becoming frozen dances that honor the creatures they so deeply revered. But the Zonai relationship with dragons extended far beyond artistic representation into realms that challenge our understanding of the possible. Among their most closely guarded secrets was the knowledge of transformation itself, the profound alchemy by which a mortal being might shed the limitations of flesh and achieve the eternal form of a dragon. This was not merely magical technique, but spiritual apotheosis, a transformation that represented the ultimate expression of Zonai wisdom and devotion. The process itself remains shrouded in mystery, its details lost to the same temporal depths that claimed so much of Zonai knowledge. What we can surmise from the evidence before us is that this transformation required not merely magical power, but a depth of spiritual preparation that few could achieve. It was perhaps the culmination of a lifetime spent in contemplation of draconic nature, a gradual alignment of mortal consciousness with the eternal perspective that dragons embodied. The three sacred dragons that grace the skies of contemporary Hyrule, Dinral, Naydra, and Farosh, carry within their eternal flight patterns what many scholars believe to be the essence of this ancient practice. Their forms, while unmistakably draconic, possess qualities that distinguish them from the wild dragons whose bones we find scattered across the landscape. There is a purposefulness to their movements, a consciousness that suggests minds that once knew mortality before embracing the infinite. If these theories hold truth, then these magnificent beings represent the successful culmination of Zonai spiritual practice, individuals who achieved the ultimate union between mortal understanding and draconic transcendence. They would have been among the most accomplished of their people, masters of both the practical and mystical arts that defined Zonai civilization. Their transformation would have been witnessed as both triumph and profound loss, the gain of immortality balanced against the departure from the community of their birth. The implications of such transformations extend into the very heart of how we understand the relationship between civilization and the divine. For the Zonai, the boundary between mortal and sacred was not a wall to be respected, but a threshold to be crossed through dedication and wisdom. Their dragon kin represented not abandonment of their people, but the ultimate expression of what their people might become. This perspective illuminates the parallel relationship between Hylians and the goddess Hylia, yet reveals profound differences in approach and understanding. Where Hylian spirituality often emphasizes service and devotion to a divine figure who remains fundamentally other, Zonai dragon worship suggested the possibility of joining the ranks of the revered. Their gods were not distant figures to be entreated, but examples to be followed, templates for their own eventual transformation. The Sky Islands themselves served as bridges between these realms of existence, floating territories where the boundaries between earth and heaven grew thin. From these aerial platforms, the Zonai could observe the flight patterns of dragons with the patience and attention of devoted students. They could study the way these creatures navigated air currents, the rhythms of their migrations, the subtle communications that passed between members of different species. This extended observation would have revealed to them the deeper patterns that governed draconic existence, the connection between elemental forces and draconic nature, the relationship between territory and identity, the ways in which these ancient beings maintained balance within the natural world. Such knowledge would have been invaluable to a people who sought not merely to coexist with dragons, but to understand them well enough to join their ranks. The Zonai likely maintained sacred sites dedicated to this study and preparation, locations where the veil between mortal and draconic consciousness grew thin through sustained ritual practice. These would have been places of pilgrimage and transformation, where the most dedicated students of draconic wisdom came to undergo the lengthy preparation required for their ultimate metamorphosis. We can imagine the ceremonies that might have marked such transformations, gatherings of the entire community to witness and celebrate the passage of one of their own into the realm of the eternal. The individual undergoing transformation would have been seen not as lost to death, but as elevated to a higher form of existence. Their consciousness expanded to encompass perspectives that mortal minds could barely grasp. The profound loneliness of such a choice would not have been overlooked by a people as wise as the Zonai. To become a dragon meant accepting an existence measured not in decades, but in eons, watching as mortal civilizations rose and fell like seasons in an endless year. Yet for those who achieved this transformation, the compensation would have been equally profound, a perspective that encompassed the deepest patterns of existence itself, an understanding that transcended the limitations of any single lifetime. The dragons that resulted from such transformations would have served as living links between the Zonai people and the forces that shaped their world. They would have been counselors and guardians, their accumulated wisdom available to guide their former people through challenges that required truly long-term thinking. In times of crisis, their perspective would have provided the context necessary to understand temporary difficulties within the framework of eternal patterns. This relationship between the transformed and their original communities suggests a model of spirituality that modern civilizations struggle to comprehend. The Zonai achieved a form of practical immortality that maintained connection rather than severing it, transformation that enhanced rather than abandoned their cultural values. Their dragon kin represented not escape from the world, but deeper engagement with its fundamental nature. As we contemplate these ancient mysteries, we find ourselves confronting questions that resonate far beyond the merely historical. The Zonai understanding of transformation and transcendence offers perspectives on the relationship between individual aspiration and community welfare, between the temporal and eternal, between the wisdom of mortals and the knowledge of gods. In their sacred bond with dragons, they discovered truths that continue to illuminate the deepest questions of existence itself. In the scattered remains that dot the contemporary landscape of Hyrule, we find not merely the fossilized remnants of an ancient age, but the living connections that bind past to present in ways both subtle and profound. The bones of those mighty dragons, weathered by countless seasons, yet retaining their essential strength, continue to serve the world of the living with a persistence that speaks to the eternal nature of their gift. The industrious bokoblins, with their practical wisdom unencumbered by academic pretension, have discovered what scholars might overlook in their pursuit of theoretical understanding. These creatures, often dismissed as mere nuisances by those who fail to appreciate their ingenuity, have recognized the exceptional qualities that dragon bone possesses when crafted into tools and weapons. Their crude but effective workshops echo with the sounds of creation, as ancient calcium is shaped into implements that far exceed the capabilities of conventional materials. The dragon bone clubs wielded by these crafty beings possess a weight and balance that speaks to the density and durability of their source material. Where ordinary wood might splinter under stress, these weapons maintain their integrity through conflicts that would destroy lesser implements. The shields crafted from the broader bone fragments demonstrate an understanding of defensive principles that suggests intelligence far greater than their creators are typically credited with possessing. Perhaps most remarkably, the bows constructed from the more flexible portions of ancient dragon skeletons exhibit properties that bridge the gap between the mundane and the magical. The natural curves preserved in these bones lend themselves to the creation of weapons whose range and accuracy surpass anything that contemporary craftsmanship might achieve through conventional means. In the hands of a skilled archer, such weapons become extensions of the ancient power that once propelled dragons through the skies above primordial Hyrule. This contemporary utilization of dragon bone raises questions that extend far beyond simple material science into realms of cultural memory and inherited wisdom. How did these creatures, lacking written traditions or formal education, discover the superior properties of ancient dragon remains? What instinctive understanding guided their selection of particular bones for specific purposes? The answers suggest forms of knowledge that transcend formal learning, wisdom that flows through practical experience and careful observation rather than academic study. The implications of this discovery ripple outward into speculation about the civilizations that shared the world with living dragons during that forgotten age. If simple bokoblins can recognize and exploit the valuable properties of dragon bone, what might the sophisticated cultures of the past have achieved with access to these materials in abundance? The mind reels at the possibilities. Entire cities constructed with dragon bone framework, weapons and armor that combined beauty with effectiveness beyond modern comprehension, furniture and decorative objects that embodied both function and reverence for their source. We might envision Zonai artisans working with the freely given gifts of their dragon allies, crafting implements that served both practical and ceremonial purposes. Dragon ribs might have formed the graceful arches of their temples, their natural curves creating spaces that echoed with the harmony between earthbound architecture and celestial aspiration. The smaller bones could have been fashioned into instruments, whose music carried across the sky islands like prayers made audible, their tones resonating with frequencies that dragons themselves might have recognized and answered. The ancient Gorons, with their mastery of metalwork and stone carving, would have found in dragon bone a material that challenged and inspired their considerable skills. The heat resistance that allows contemporary dragon bone implements to withstand the harsh conditions near volcanic regions suggests that these materials could have been integrated into the forges and workshops of Death Mountain itself. Hammers with dragon bone handles would have conducted heat in ways that enhanced rather than hindered the smith's work, while anvils mounted on dragon bone foundations would have provided stability that endured through the most vigorous metalworking sessions. The Gerudo, masters of survival in the harshest environments, might have discovered in dragon bone the perfect material for tools designed to endure the extremes of desert life, weapons that maintained their edge through sandstorms that would dull conventional blades, water containers that preserved precious moisture through the alchemy of their ancient composition, architectural elements that provided both strength and insulation against the brutal temperature variations of their desert homeland. Even the aquatic civilizations that flourished in Hyrule's rivers and lakes might have found uses for dragon bone that modern understanding can barely imagine. The bones of dragons that once soared above the waters could have been crafted into vessels whose design principles incorporated both the aerodynamics of flight and the hydrodynamics of swimming. Boats that moved through water with unprecedented grace, fishing implements that attracted their quarry through properties that remained mysterious, even to their users. The question of nomenclature adds another layer of intrigue to these discoveries. Dragon bone mire carries its identification in its very name, yet no contemporary resident of Hyrule claims credit for this designation. The naming itself becomes a mystery that spans the centuries, suggesting cultural memories that have survived the passage of time through mechanisms we do not fully understand. Perhaps the name has been passed down through generations of travelers and explorers, each adding their own understanding to a tradition that preserves essential truths even as it loses specific details. This phenomenon of preserved naming extends beyond a single location to encompass the broader recognition of what these remains represent. Across the diverse regions of Hyrule, from the frozen reaches of Hebra to the scorching sands of Gerudo, local populations seem to possess an instinctive understanding that these bones belong to creatures of extraordinary significance. The reverence with which even the simplest folk approach these remains suggests cultural memories that operate below the level of conscious knowledge. The contemporary usage of dragon bone by various creatures and cultures creates a living link between the ancient past and the present moment. Each club crafted by industrious hands, each shield shaped from ancient ribs, each bow strung with sinew and bone becomes a functional memorial to the age that birthed these materials. The dragons live on not merely in the static preservation of their skeletal remains, but in the active utilization of their gifts by the current inhabitants of their former domain. This practical immortality extends the influence of the Dragon Age into the daily lives of Hyrule's contemporary residents in ways that formal historical preservation could never achieve. A bokoblin wielding a dragon bone club carries forward the strength and durability that defined those ancient creatures, while a traveler sheltering behind a dragon bone shield benefits from protective qualities that echo the defensive capabilities of their original owners. The circle completes itself in ways that suggest deeper patterns at work in the relationship between past and present. The dragons that once ruled the skies of primordial Hyrule continue to serve the land they claimed as their own, their remains providing strength and protection to creatures that never knew their living majesty. In this service, we glimpse the possibility that their disappearance was not mere extinction, but transformation into a different form of existence, their consciousness perhaps distributed through the very landscape they once dominated. Through the practical wisdom of simple creatures and the enduring strength of ancient bone, the Dragon Age maintains its presence in the contemporary world, bridging the gap between legend and reality with the substantial weight of material fact. Beneath the imposing majesty of Death Mountain, where the Earth's molten heart has shaped landscapes of both beauty and peril, lies evidence of a civilization whose grandeur once rivaled the volcanic forces that surrounded it. The discovery of these ancient Goron settlements in the depths below the familiar surface reveals not merely archaeological curiosities, but testament to engineering ambitions and social organization that challenges our understanding of what these remarkable people achieved in ages past. The ruins that emerge from the shadowed depths speak of construction on a scale that dwarfs the contemporary Goron city, their stone frameworks suggesting populations and purposes that extended far beyond the mining operations that modern observers might initially assume. These are not the rough-hewn shelters of a purely industrial settlement, but the carefully planned districts of a true metropolis, complete with the sophisticated infrastructure necessary to support thousands of inhabitants across multiple generations. The architectural sophistication evident in these ruins demonstrates mastery of engineering principles that allowed the Gorons to work with the challenging environment beneath Death Mountain, rather than simply enduring it. The careful channeling of geothermal energy through carved conduits speaks to understanding of thermodynamics that enabled them to regulate temperature throughout their subterranean city. The strategic placement of chambers and corridors reveals planning that accounted for both the practical needs of daily life and the ceremonial requirements of a culture that honored the living mountain as the source of their prosperity. When we compare these discoveries to the Goron settlements recorded in the annals of other eras, fascinating parallels emerge that suggest continuity of cultural values across vast spans of time. The Dodongo Cavern of ancient days, with its intricate network of chambers and its integration of natural and constructed elements, shares design principles with these deeper ruins. Both demonstrate the Goron preference for working within existing geological structures while enhancing them through careful modification and expansion. The similarities extend beyond mere architectural approach to encompass the sophisticated understanding of mining operations that defined Goron civilization across multiple timelines. The evidence suggests that these ancient inhabitants of the depths possessed knowledge of mineral extraction and processing that enabled them to harvest the mountain's wealth with efficiency that modern techniques might envy. The scale of their operations, judged by the extensive tunnel networks and processing facilities carved into the living rock, speaks to an understanding of geology that allowed them to locate and exploit the richest veins of precious metals and gemstones. Yet these ruins reveal more than simple industrial capability. The presence of chambers, clearly designed for communal gathering and ceremonial purposes, demonstrates that the inhabitants of this underground metropolis maintained the social and spiritual traditions that have always characterized Goron culture. The careful placement of these ceremonial spaces in relation to the mountain's natural rhythms suggests a people who understood their environment, not merely as a resource to be exploited, but as a living entity whose moods and movements required respectful accommodation. The integration of advanced technology throughout the ruins speaks to innovation that bridged the practical and the ingenious, in ways that contemporary observers struggle to fully appreciate. The mechanisms that once regulated air flow through the vast network of chambers demonstrate understanding of ventilation principles that prevented the accumulation of dangerous gases while maintaining the elevated temperatures that Gorons require for optimal health and comfort. The sophisticated systems for moving massive quantities of extracted materials through the tunnel networks reveal engineering solutions that maximized efficiency while minimizing the physical strain on even the remarkably strong Goron workforce. The hot springs that dot the ruins serve purposes both practical and restorative, their careful integration into the city's design speaking to recognition of the importance of recreation and rejuvenation in maintaining community health across the demanding conditions of subterranean life. These thermal pools, fed by the mountain's natural heat and carefully maintained through ingenious regulation systems, provided spaces where the inhabitants could gather for both social interaction and physical restoration. After long shifts in the mines and forges, the presence of distinct residential districts within the ruins suggests social organization that accommodated different roles and responsibilities within the community. The larger chambers near the primary mining operations likely housed the workers whose daily labor extracted the mountain's treasures, while the more elaborate quarters positioned closer to the ceremonial centers probably served the elders and specialists whose wisdom guided both practical operations and spiritual observances. The workshop areas scattered throughout the complex reveal the full scope of Goron manufacturing capabilities during this ancient period. The remains of forges designed to work with both traditional Goron techniques and the abundant mineral resources available in the depths suggest production capabilities that extended far beyond simple tool-making into the realm of true artisanship. The careful arrangement of these workspaces in relation to both raw material sources and transportation networks demonstrates planning that maximized productivity while maintaining the quality standards that have always characterized Goron craftsmanship. Perhaps most remarkably, the ruins suggest connections to the surface world that enabled the inhabitants to maintain contact with the broader community of Hyrule while pursuing their subterranean prosperity. The evidence of trade networks and diplomatic facilities speaks to a civilization that understood its role within the larger kingdom while maintaining the distinct cultural identity that has always defined the Goron people. The integration of the Fire Temple complex into this broader urban structure reveals the true scope of what was once achieved beneath Death Mountain. Rather than existing as an isolated religious site, the temple served as the spiritual and practical heart of a thriving metropolis, whose influence extended throughout the mountain's interior. The careful coordination between temple functions and civic infrastructure demonstrates the deep integration of spiritual and temporal concerns that characterized the most successful periods of Goron civilization. The transportation networks that connected these various districts speak to engineering solutions that overcame the considerable challenges of moving people and goods through the complex, three-dimensional environment of the mountain's interior. The evidence suggests systems that utilized both Goron physical capabilities and ingenious mechanical assistance to maintain efficient communication and commerce throughout the sprawling underground metropolis. The sheer scale of these ruins, spanning from the deepest accessible chambers to areas that approach the familiar surface installations, suggests a population and prosperity that positioned this ancient settlement as one of the most significant urban centers in the history of Hyrule. The careful integration of mining, manufacturing, residential, ceremonial, and administrative functions within a single coordinated complex demonstrates planning and execution that rivals the greatest achievements of any civilization that has claimed dominion over these lands. In contemplating these magnificent ruins, we find ourselves confronting evidence of Goron capabilities that exceeded even the considerable reputation these people have maintained throughout the recorded history of Hyrule, suggesting that the true golden age of their civilization may lie not in the familiar stories of more recent times, but in the shadowed depths where their greatest achievements await rediscovery by those patient enough to seek them. The magnificent civilization that once flourished beneath a Death Mountain did not fade through the gradual erosion of time or the simple exhaustion of resources that might claim lesser settlements. Instead, the evidence suggests a catastrophic disruption that swept across the kingdom with such devastating thoroughness that it left even the most secure strongholds vulnerable to forces that seemed impossible to resist. In the preserved memories of Princess Zelda, recovered from that distant era when the foundations of Hyrule itself trembled beneath the weight of approaching darkness, we find clues to the tragic fate that befell the underground metropolis of the Gorons. The reports delivered by the ancient sages during those desperate days speak to a campaign of destruction so systematic and overwhelming that it transformed the very nature of civilization across the kingdom. When the sage responsible for monitoring the Gerudo territories reported that the last free village of that desert realm had fallen to Ganondorf's relentless advance, the implications extended far beyond the immediate tragedy of that single community's loss. The language used suggests not merely military defeat, but the complete elimination of organized resistance across entire regions. The demon army that served as Ganondorf's instrument of conquest possessed capabilities that transcended conventional warfare, their supernatural nature allowing them to overcome obstacles that would have turned back mortal forces. The heat and treacherous passages that protected Gorondia from surface threats would have presented no meaningful barrier to entities whose very existence defied natural limitations. Where conventional armies might have found the journey into the mountain's depths impossible to sustain, these demonic forces could pursue their destructive mission regardless of environmental challenges. The systematic nature of Ganondorf's assault on the kingdom reveals strategic thinking that targeted not merely military objectives, but the very foundations of civilized life. The reports from the ancient sages suggest coordinated attacks that struck simultaneously at widely separated locations, preventing any region from coming to the aid of others and ensuring that resistance could not coalesce into effective opposition. This approach would have been particularly devastating to the interconnected communities that characterized the kingdom during that era. The Gorons, despite their legendary strength and their advantageous position within the mountain's natural defenses, would have found themselves facing enemies whose supernatural abilities neutralized many of their traditional advantages. The narrow passages and defensive positions that might have allowed relatively small numbers of defenders to hold off. Conventional attackers would have provided little protection against foes capable of manifesting in unexpected locations or employing magical abilities that bypassed physical barriers entirely. The underground city's very strengths may have become liabilities during the assault, as the extensive tunnel networks that facilitated movement and commerce during peaceful times could have provided multiple avenues for infiltration once the outer defenses were breached. The complex three-dimensional layout that allowed the city to accommodate thousands of inhabitants would have created numerous isolated pockets where defenders could be overwhelmed separately, preventing the coordinated resistance that might have been possible in a more conventional surface settlement. The integration of the Fire Temple into the heart of the city's structure would have made the loss particularly devastating from both practical and spiritual perspectives. The temple served not merely as a religious center, but as the focal point around which much of the community's daily life revolved. Its capture or destruction would have shattered the cultural cohesion that held the community together, leaving survivors demoralized and disconnected from the traditions that had sustained their ancestors through previous challenges. The aftermath of such an assault would have left the surviving Goron population scattered and diminished, their numbers reduced to a fraction of what had been necessary to maintain the extensive underground metropolis. The massive scale of the ancient city, designed to accommodate thousands of inhabitants, engaged in complex mining and manufacturing operations, would have become not an asset, but a burden for the remnant community struggling to rebuild from the devastation. The decision to abandon the depths and establish new settlements on the mountain's surface represents more than mere practical adaptation to reduced numbers. It reflects a fundamental shift in Goron culture from the confident expansion that characterized their golden age to the cautious preservation that has marked their approach to community building in subsequent eras. The surface settlements, while successful in their own right, never achieved the scale or sophistication that the archaeological evidence suggests characterized their subterranean predecessors. This transformation from expansion to consolidation echoes patterns visible throughout Hyrule's history, where the trauma of Ganondorf's ancient campaign continued to influence cultural development long after the immediate threat had been contained. Communities that had once pursued ambitious projects and maintained extensive networks of trade and cooperation adopted more defensive postures that prioritized security over growth and local self-sufficiency over regional integration. The psychological impact of witnessing the destruction of what must have seemed an impregnable stronghold would have resonated throughout Goron culture for generations. The confidence that had allowed their ancestors to carve an entire city from the living rock of Death Mountain was replaced by the hard-won wisdom that even the mightiest achievements could be swept away by forces beyond mortal comprehension or resistance. The King Rauru's ultimate sacrifice to contain Ganondorf's rampage prevented total devastation, but could not restore what had already been lost. The imprisoning war's conclusion brought peace to the kingdom, but left behind a landscape transformed by loss, where survivor communities had to rebuild not merely their physical infrastructure, but their understanding of what was possible and what was prudent in an uncertain world. The gradual abandonment of the deeper chambers and tunnels that had once buzzed with activity speaks to the practical challenges of maintaining such extensive infrastructure with drastically reduced populations. The sophisticated systems that had regulated airflow, temperature, and transportation throughout the underground metropolis required constant maintenance and operation by skilled technicians, whose numbers were no longer sufficient to keep the entire complex functional. The selective preservation of certain areas while allowing others to fall into ruin reflects difficult choices about which aspects of their ancestral heritage could be maintained with available resources. The areas closest to the surface and most easily accessed were prioritized for continued use, while the deeper chambers that had once housed the most ambitious achievements of Goron engineering were reluctantly surrendered to the encroaching darkness. The modern Fire Temple, though impressive in its own right, represents adaptation to these new realities rather than restoration of ancient capabilities. Its design reflects the wisdom gained through tragedy, incorporating both the spiritual traditions that sustained Goron culture through its darkest period and the practical lessons learned about the importance of defensibility and maintainability in an uncertain world. In the ruins of Gorondia, we find not merely the remnants of a lost civilization, but a meditation on the fragility of even the greatest achievements when confronted with evil that transcends conventional understanding. The silence that now fills chambers that once echoed with the sounds of industry and community serves as a somber reminder that progress and prosperity, however firmly established they may seem, remain vulnerable to forces that operate beyond the boundaries of natural law and moral restraint. In the misty realm where forest secrets whisper through ancient leaves, a small blue light dances with purpose that transcends the simple guidance it appears to offer. Navi, the fairy without a child, carries within her diminutive form mysteries that challenge our most fundamental assumptions about the nature of companionship and the true meaning of destiny. Her knowledge extends far beyond what any forest-dwelling sprite should reasonably possess, reaching into territories both geographical and conceptual that suggest connections to powers and purposes that remain carefully hidden from casual observation. The very circumstances of her assignment to Link speak to arrangements that operate beyond the visible mechanisms of fate and coincidence. When the great Deku tree, in his ancient wisdom, sensed the approaching darkness that would soon engulf the kingdom, his choice of Navi as companion for the destined hero suggests knowledge of her capabilities that extends far beyond her apparent role as a simple guide. The designation of fairy without a child carries implications that resonate through the deeper structures of forest society, hinting at origins and loyalties that may not align with the obvious interpretation of her mission. Her encyclopedic knowledge of enemies and locations throughout Hyrule presents the first and perhaps most troubling evidence of connections that transcend her supposed forest origins. When Link encounters creatures in distant lands, whose weaknesses Navi can immediately identify, when she provides tactical advice about foes that supposedly exist far beyond the boundaries of Kokiri territory, we must ask ourselves how such information came to reside within her consciousness. The precision of her knowledge suggests not casual familiarity, but intimate understanding born of close observation and detailed study. The dungeons that Link must navigate present even more compelling evidence of Navi's suspicious familiarity with territories that should be foreign to any forest fairy. Her ability to provide specific guidance about the internal layouts of ancient temples, her detailed knowledge of the mechanical systems that govern their operation, her immediate recognition of the bosses that guard their deepest chambers. All of this speaks to preparation that extends far beyond what the great Deku Tree's instructions could reasonably have provided. Most disturbing of all is her apparent understanding of the forces and creatures associated with Ganondorf's campaign of darkness. Where one might expect a fairy of the forest to recoil from knowledge of such corruption, Navi demonstrates familiarity with the weaknesses and strategies of enemies that serve the forces of evil. Her tactical advice proves consistently effective against creatures that embody the very antithesis of everything the forest represents, suggesting study that could only have been conducted through direct observation or detailed briefings from sources with intimate knowledge of the enemy's capabilities. The timing of critical events throughout Link's quest reveals patterns that suggest coordination rather than coincidence. Navi's presence at moments of crucial revelation, her ability to appear precisely when her guidance proves most necessary, her uncanny knack for directing Link's attention to details that advance his mission. All of this speaks to planning that operates according to schedules and objectives that may not align with the hero's apparent interests. The revelation of Princess Zelda's true identity in the Temple of Time marks the moment when these suspicious patterns crystallize into something approaching certainty. The careful orchestration required for Ganondorf to arrive at precisely the moment when Zelda reveals herself to Link, and Navi suggests intelligence gathering and communication that transcends the conventional explanations offered by the visible narrative. The speed with which the King of Evil responds to this development implies preparation that could only have been possible with advanced knowledge of Zelda's intentions and location. The conventional explanation that attributes Ganondorf's awareness to the mystical properties of the Triforce encounters significant logical obstacles when subjected to careful examination. If proximity to the Triforce of Wisdom automatically revealed Zelda's location, her ability to maintain her disguise as Sheik for extended periods becomes inexplicable. The suggestion that Sheikah garments or techniques could mask such fundamental magical emanations stretches credibility beyond reasonable limits, particularly given the lack of evidence for such sophisticated concealment capabilities elsewhere in the historical record. Navi's position as the sole witness to Zelda's revelation, combined with her demonstrated knowledge of territories and creatures throughout Hyrule, presents a far more plausible explanation for Ganondorf's rapid response. Her ability to communicate across vast distances through fairy magic, while never explicitly demonstrated, aligns with the mystical capabilities attributed to her kind throughout the folklore and legends that surround such beings. The possibility that her loyalties extend beyond the forest and its chosen hero into arrangements with darker powers transforms every aspect of her guidance into potential manipulation. The retrospective examination of her advice throughout the quest reveals subtle patterns that, while superficially helpful to Link's immediate objectives, may have served larger purposes that align more closely with Ganondorf's ultimate goals. Her guidance consistently leads the hero deeper into situations that increase his power and capabilities, transforming him from a forest child into a warrior capable of challenging the most formidable opponents. Yet this development, while apparently beneficial to the forces of good, also serves to eliminate obstacles and rivals that might otherwise have complicated Ganondorf's own plans for dominion. The strategic implications of creating a hero capable of defeating the existing guardians and champions of Hyrule become apparent when viewed from the perspective of a mastermind seeking to consolidate power without the interference of established authorities. Link's quest systematically removes or neutralizes every significant force that might have opposed Ganondorf's rule, from the spiritual guardians of the temples to the sages whose power could have provided alternative sources of resistance. The fairy's intimate knowledge of the locations and weaknesses of these guardians takes on sinister implications when considered as intelligence gathering rather than innocent guidance. Her ability to direct Link to precisely the right strategies for overcoming each obstacle suggests preparation that serves multiple purposes, advancing the hero's quest while simultaneously mapping the capabilities and vulnerabilities of potential threats to her true master's ambitions. The psychological manipulation inherent in such an arrangement extends beyond simple, tactical deception into realms of emotional exploitation that challenge our understanding of trust and companionship. If Navi's apparent loyalty to Link masks deeper allegiances to his enemies, then her every expression of concern and encouragement becomes an instrument of manipulation, designed to maintain his cooperation while advancing objectives that may ultimately work against his interests and those of everyone he seeks to protect. The isolation that such a revelation would impose upon the hero becomes almost unbearable to contemplate. Throughout his quest, Link relies upon Navi not merely for practical guidance, but for the emotional support that makes his lonely journey endurable. The possibility that this companionship itself represents a calculated deception transforms the very foundation of his experience from heroic adventure into elaborate psychological manipulation. Yet even this dark interpretation cannot fully account for the complexity of motivations and loyalties that may govern fairy behavior in a world where the boundaries between good and evil prove far more fluid than simple narratives suggest. The possibility remains that Navi serves multiple masters simultaneously, pursuing objectives that advance both Link's immediate interests and Ganondorf's longer-term goals through arrangements that transcend the conventional understanding of loyalty and betrayal. In the delicate balance between guidance and manipulation, between companionship and exploitation, we find reflected the deeper ambiguities that characterize the moral landscape of a world where heroes and villains may be pursuing objectives that prove more interconnected than either fully comprehends. The phenomenon of guidance that conceals ulterior motives extends far beyond the singular case of a suspicious fairy into patterns that characterize the deeper structures of power and influence throughout the history of Hyrule. When we examine the chronicles and legends that preserve the memory of great events across multiple eras, we discover recurring themes of assistance that proves more complex than its initial appearance suggests. Alliances that shift according to motivations that remain hidden from those they claim to serve, and revelations that transform understanding of who truly benefits from the actions of heroes and villains alike. The treacherous midwife, who serves as advisor to the king of Hyrule during one of the kingdom's most vulnerable periods, exemplifies how proximity to power creates opportunities for manipulation that operate beneath the surface of apparent loyalty. Her position of trust within the royal household provides access to information and influence that proves devastating when employed in service of objectives that directly contradict the welfare of those she pretends to serve. The systematic nature of her betrayal reveals planning that extends across years of careful preparation, demonstrating how patience and deception can achieve objectives that direct confrontation could never accomplish. The Shadow Temple's corrupted priest represents another manifestation of how sacred trust becomes the vehicle for corruption that undermines the very foundations of spiritual authority. His position as guardian of one of Hyrule's most important religious sites provides both the legitimacy and the access necessary to pursue goals that pervert the temple's original purpose. The transformation of a place meant to serve the spiritual needs of the community into an instrument of darkness illustrates how corruption operates most effectively through the subversion of existing institutions rather than their direct destruction. These historical examples illuminate the particular vulnerability of magical beings, whose nature grants them access to realms of knowledge and influence that mortal minds struggle to comprehend fully. Fairies, with their connection to forces that transcend ordinary understanding, possess capabilities that make them invaluable allies, but also dangerous enemies. Their longevity allows them to pursue objectives that span multiple mortal lifetimes. Their magical abilities enable them to gather and transmit information across vast distances, and their apparent innocence provides cover for activities that more obviously powerful beings could never conduct without detection. The cultural mythology surrounding fairy folk throughout various civilizations reveals consistent themes of ambiguous loyalty and hidden agendas that suggest widespread recognition of their complex nature. The stories passed down through generations speak of fairy assistance that comes with prices that become apparent only after the initial bargain has been accepted, of guidance that leads travelers to destinations they never intended to reach, of relationships that begin with apparent mutual benefit but evolve into arrangements where one party discovers they have been serving interests they never consciously chose to support. The magical abilities attributed to fairy kind in the oldest traditions include forms of influence that operate directly upon consciousness and perception, capabilities that could enable them to shape the thoughts and decisions of their companions in ways that appear to respect free will while actually directing outcomes according to predetermined objectives. The suggestion that such powers might be employed not merely for protection and guidance, but for manipulation and control transforms our understanding of what it means to accept fairy assistance in pursuit of heroic goals. The patterns of betrayal that emerge from careful study of Hyrulean history reveal strategic thinking that operates according to principles that transcend simple moral categories of good and evil. The most effective deceptions appear to involve genuine assistance that serves the immediate needs of the deceived party, while advancing longer-term objectives that ultimately work against their interests. This approach requires understanding of human psychology sophisticated enough to predict how apparent allies will respond to various forms of help and guidance. The temporal dimension of such elaborate deceptions cannot be overlooked when considering the capabilities required to maintain them across the extended periods necessary for their ultimate success. The coordination of events across years or even decades demands not merely strategic vision, but practical abilities that enable the orchestration of complex sequences of cause and effect. The manipulation of multiple parties simultaneously, ensuring that each plays their assigned role without becoming aware of the larger pattern of which they form only a part, speaks to intelligence and capabilities that operate on scales that mortal minds find difficult to comprehend. The psychological techniques employed in such extended deceptions reveal understanding of the fundamental drives and vulnerabilities that motivate heroic behavior. The exploitation of altruistic impulses, the careful cultivation of emotional dependencies, the strategic provision of information that appears to serve the hero's interests while actually advancing the manipulator's agenda. All of these approaches require intimate knowledge of how noble intentions can be redirected toward objectives that their possessors would reject if they understood their true nature. The institutional structures that govern relationships between magical beings and mortal civilizations provide frameworks within which such deceptions can operate with reduced risk of detection. The traditions of fairy guardianship, with their emphasis on trust and obedience to seemingly benevolent guidance, create expectations that discourage the kind of skeptical inquiry that might reveal hidden agendas. The cultural narratives that celebrate fairy assistance as invariably beneficial establish cognitive frameworks that make it difficult for recipients of such help to consider alternative interpretations of their experiences. The broader implications of systematic deception within the realm of spiritual guidance extend into fundamental questions about the nature of divine intervention and the reliability of supernatural assistance. If the beings who present themselves as agents of beneficial forces may actually serve objectives that contradict the welfare of those they claim to help, then the entire framework of trust upon which heroic endeavors depend becomes subject to doubt and re-examination. The psychological isolation that results from the discovery of such betrayal creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited by the very forces that initiated the deception. The hero who learns that their most trusted companion may have been serving enemy interests faces not merely tactical disadvantage, but emotional devastation that can paralyze decision-making at crucial moments. The erosion of confidence in one's ability to distinguish between genuine allies and sophisticated enemies creates hesitation and uncertainty that serve the interests of those who benefit from chaos and confusion. Yet the complexity of motivations that govern behavior in a world where multiple forms of consciousness interact across different scales of existence suggests that even apparent betrayal may serve purposes that transcend the understanding of any single participant. The possibility remains that actions which appear treacherous from one perspective may represent necessary elements in larger patterns of causation that ultimately serve beneficial outcomes through mechanisms too complex for mortal comprehension. The recognition of such possibilities does not diminish the tragedy experienced by those who discover that their trust has been misplaced, nor does it excuse the suffering caused by deception and manipulation. Rather, it illuminates the profound challenges faced by conscious beings who must navigate relationships with entities whose capabilities and motivations may operate according to principles that transcend conventional moral frameworks. In the delicate balance between wisdom and paranoia, between appropriate caution and paralyzing suspicion, we find reflected the eternal challenge of maintaining both effectiveness and integrity, while operating within systems where the true nature of assistance and opposition may remain hidden until the moment when such knowledge becomes either salvation or catastrophe. In the vast tapestry of knowledge that encompasses the mysteries of Hyrule, we discover that individual threads of understanding gain their true significance only when woven together into patterns that reveal connections spanning eons and civilizations. The ancient bones of dragons, scattered across the landscape, speak not merely to a forgotten age of magnificent creatures, but to the foundations upon which later cultures would build their understanding of power and transcendence. The Zonai, people's reverence for these beings, emerges not as isolated religious practice, but as recognition of truths that connected their aerial civilization to forces that had shaped the world long before their sky islands graced the heavens. The sophisticated underground metropolis of the Gorons reveals itself as more than an impressive feat of engineering when considered alongside the evidence of dragon remains found in the depths below their city. The positioning of these ancient skeletons directly beneath the locations of greatest Goron achievement suggests relationships between geological forces and draconic presence that influenced the very locations where civilizations chose to establish their most important settlements. The mineral wealth that attracted Goron miners to these particular sites may have been concentrated there through processes connected to the ancient dragons whose bones now mark these territories as places of special significance. The patterns of destruction that swept across the kingdom during Ganondorf's ancient campaign gain additional layers of meaning when examined in light of the systematic targeting of locations that held both strategic importance and connections to the deeper mysteries of Hyrule's past. The assault on Gorondia was not merely an attempt to eliminate a military stronghold, but an effort to sever living connections to ancient knowledge and power sources that might have provided resistance to his dominion. The underground city's proximity to Dragon remains may have been no coincidence, but evidence of power sources that the King of Evil recognized as threats to his ambitions. The fairy Navi's suspicious knowledge of territories and creatures throughout Hyrule takes on new dimensions when considered within the broader context of how information and influence flow through networks that span both temporal and dimensional boundaries. Her familiarity with the weaknesses of enemies and the secrets of dungeons may reflect access to forms of knowledge that transcend individual experience and tap into collective memories preserved through mechanisms that operate beyond conventional understanding. The possibility that fairy consciousness connects to information networks that encompass the entire history of the kingdom transforms her guidance from simple woodland wisdom into something approaching omniscience. The convergence of these seemingly separate mysteries suggests underlying structures of reality that operate according to principles more complex than surface appearances would indicate. The dragons whose bones now serve as raw material for contemporary weapons may have been conscious participants in processes that continue to influence events long after their physical forms have been reduced to skeletal remains. Their strategic placement across the landscape, their connection to sites that later became centers of civilization, their apparent relationship to the power sources that attracted various peoples to establish their most important settlements. All of this speaks to intelligence and purpose that transcended simple biological existence. The Zonai understanding of dragon transformation gains profound significance when viewed as recognition of continuity rather than metamorphosis. If consciousness can persist through changes of form that appear to represent death and rebirth, then the dragons whose bones dot the landscape may represent not extinct creatures, but transformed beings, whose influence continues through mechanisms that operate below the threshold of ordinary perception. The three sacred dragons that grace contemporary skies may be the most obvious manifestations of this continuity, but the evidence suggests that consciousness and purpose may persist in forms that remain invisible to casual observation. The underground ruins of Garandia reveal architectural principles that echo the spiral forms characteristic of dragon flight patterns and Zonai design aesthetics, suggesting cultural exchange and shared understanding that operated across the apparent boundaries between aerial and subterranean civilizations. The sophisticated ventilation systems that regulated airflow through the mountain city mirror the aerodynamic principles that govern dragon flight, while the thermal management techniques employed by Goron engineers reflect understanding of metabolic processes that parallel those required for the maintenance of draconic physiology. The systematic nature of Ganondorf's assault on these interconnected power centers suggests strategic thinking that recognized the threats posed by civilizations that maintained contact with forms of knowledge and capability that preceded his own rise to prominence. The targeting of locations that held both practical importance and symbolic significance reveals understanding of how power operates through networks that encompass both visible institutions and hidden connections that span the boundaries between past and present. The patterns of guidance and manipulation that characterize relationships between mortal heroes and supernatural companions gain additional complexity when viewed as expressions of conflicts that operate across multiple levels of reality simultaneously. Navi's potential dual loyalties may reflect not simple betrayal, but participation in processes that serve objectives too large and complex for any single consciousness to comprehend fully. Her guidance of Link through challenges that eliminate obstacles to Ganondorf's ambitions, while simultaneously preparing the hero for ultimate confrontation with those same dark forces, suggests strategic thinking that operates according to principles that transcend conventional moral categories. The environmental storytelling that preserves the memory of ancient dragons through skeletal remains scattered across the landscape operates in parallel with the cultural storytelling that preserves the memory of lost civilizations through ruins and artifacts that continue to influence contemporary events. The bones that provide raw material for modern weapons carry forward not merely the physical properties of their original owners, but the accumulated wisdom and power that those beings represented during their active existence. The scholarly pursuit of truth within these interconnected mysteries requires recognition that individual discoveries gain their full significance only when integrated into comprehensive understanding that acknowledges the relationships between apparently separate phenomena. The dragon bones, the Zonai ruins, the Goron city, the fairy guidance, the patterns of conquest and resistance. All of these elements participate in larger narratives that span timescales and dimensional boundaries that challenge conventional approaches to knowledge and understanding. The theories that emerge from careful consideration of these connections necessarily partake of speculation and intuition, as well as factual analysis, recognizing that the most important truths may operate through mechanisms that transcend the boundaries of empirical verification. The acceptance of uncertainty becomes not a weakness in such investigations, but a necessary prerequisite for remaining open to possibilities that conventional thinking might prematurely dismiss. The interconnected nature of these mysteries suggests that future discoveries will continue to reveal additional layers of complexity and connection, each new piece of evidence illuminating relationships that were previously hidden while simultaneously raising questions that extend the boundaries of what requires explanation. The pursuit of understanding becomes not a quest for final answers, but a perpetual exploration of relationships that prove ever more intricate and profound as investigation deepens. In this eternal dance between knowledge and mystery, between discovery and question, we find reflected the fundamental nature of existence itself, where every answer reveals new horizons of possibility, and every solution opens doors to challenges that exceed the imagination of those who first posed the original questions. In the grand architecture of time that encompasses the history of Hyrule, we discover patterns that repeat with the persistence of natural law, yet manifest with variations that speak to the eternal tension between fate and freedom, between the inevitability of certain fundamental conflicts and the infinite creativity with which conscious beings respond to their circumstances. The rise and fall of civilizations across the ages reveals not mere historical accident, but participation in cycles that operate according to principles deeper than political ambition or technological advancement. The dragons that once ruled the primordial skies of Hyrule established patterns of dominance and transcendence that would echo through every subsequent era, their bones now serving as both memorial to their departed majesty and foundation for the achievements of later peoples. Their disappearance from active participation in the world's affairs marks not simple extinction, but transformation into forms of influence that operate through mechanisms less obvious, but no less profound than their original physical presence. The scattered remains that dot the contemporary landscape speak to power that persists through death itself, consciousness that finds expression in new forms while maintaining connection to its essential nature. The Zonai civilization that followed understood these patterns with clarity that enabled them to work in harmony with forces that lesser peoples might have attempted to dominate or destroy. Their recognition that transcendence was possible through willing transformation, rather than desperate struggle against mortality, represents wisdom that transcends the specific techniques they employed to achieve union with draconic consciousness. Their sky islands served not merely as elevated territories, but as symbolic bridges between the temporal and eternal, platforms from which the relationship between mortal aspiration and divine possibility could be contemplated and ultimately realized. The underground metropolis of the Gorons demonstrates how civilizations that align themselves with the fundamental structures of their environment can achieve stability and prosperity that endure across centuries of changing surface conditions. Their deep connection to the living mountain that sheltered and sustained them reflects understanding that true security comes not from imposing artificial structures upon natural forces, but from discovering how to work within patterns that have operated since the world's foundation. The sophisticated engineering that characterized their subterranean city emerged from recognition of principles that governed both geological processes and social organization. The catastrophic assault that brought this golden age to its conclusion reveals how the introduction of forces that operate according to different principles can disrupt even the most carefully balanced systems. Ganondorf's demon army represented not merely military threat, but the invasion of consciousness oriented toward domination rather than harmony, destruction rather than creation, isolation rather than connection. The systematic nature of his campaign reflects understanding that lasting conquest requires not merely the defeat of armies, but the elimination of the cultural and spiritual foundations that enable resistance to regenerate across generations. Yet even this apparent triumph of darkness over light participates in larger patterns that ensure the eventual restoration of balance through mechanisms that operate beyond the comprehension of any single participant. The heroes who arise in response to such threats carry forward not merely the courage and skill necessary for immediate victory, but the accumulated wisdom of all previous struggles against similar forces. Their victories preserve not merely the political independence of the kingdom, but the spiritual principles that enable civilization itself to persist through the inevitable cycles of challenge and renewal. The guidance provided by supernatural companions throughout these struggles reflects the operation of intelligence that spans the boundaries between individual consciousness and collective wisdom, between mortal understanding and divine knowledge. The ambiguities that surround such relationships speak not to fundamental corruption, but to the complexity of motivations that govern beings whose perspective encompasses timescales and objectives that transcend the immediate concerns of any single era or conflict. The patterns of betrayal and loyalty that characterize these relationships mirror the larger cycles of destruction and renewal that define the relationship between chaos and order in the cosmic framework within which all these events unfold. The apparent contradictions between guidance that serves immediate needs and objectives that operate according to longer-term considerations reflect the inherent tension between perspectives that focus on immediate welfare and wisdom that encompasses the ultimate consequences of present choices. The archaeological evidence that preserves the memory of lost civilizations operates in parallel with the cultural traditions that maintain awareness of recurring challenges and the methods by which they have been successfully addressed in the past. The ruins that dot the landscape serve not merely as monuments to vanished glory, but as repositories of knowledge that becomes available to future generations when circumstances require access to understanding that transcends contemporary limitations. The environmental storytelling that speaks through scattered bones and crumbling architecture participates in forms of communication that operate across temporal boundaries that exceed the lifespan of any individual consciousness. The dragons whose remains provide raw material for contemporary tools continue to serve the living world through mechanisms that transform their ancient strength into resources for current struggles. The Zonai, whose sky islands have fallen to earth, leave behind architectural principles and spiritual insights that inform the approach of later builders and seekers. The technological innovations that emerge from each civilization's encounter with these inherited resources reflect not mere practical adaptation, but creative interpretation that adds new layers of meaning to ancient achievements. The Goron techniques for working with dragon bone reveal understanding that bridges the gap between reverence for the source material and practical utilization of its properties. The Bokoblin weapons crafted from the same materials demonstrate how even simple minds can recognize and employ qualities that transcend ordinary understanding. The scholarly investigation that attempts to map these connections and understand their implications participates in the eternal human quest to comprehend the relationship between individual experience and universal patterns, between personal choice and cosmic necessity. The theories that emerge from such investigation necessarily partake of both analytical rigor and intuitive leap, recognizing that the most important truths may operate through mechanisms that exceed the boundaries of conventional proof. The recursive nature of these investigations reveals how each generation's understanding of the past influences its approach to present challenges, while simultaneously shaping the legacy it will leave for future seekers. The questions that arise from contemplating ancient mysteries become the foundation for new forms of inquiry that extend the boundaries of what can be known, while preserving awareness of what must remain forever beyond complete comprehension. The wisdom that emerges from patient observation of these patterns encompasses recognition that destruction and creation, loss and discovery, conflict and resolution represent not opposing forces but complementary aspects of processes that operate according to principles deeper than any partisan understanding can encompass. The heroes who defend the light and the shadows that threaten to overwhelm it participate equally in the eternal dance through which consciousness explores the full range of its possibilities. In accepting the cyclical nature of these eternal conflicts, we find not resignation to meaningless repetition, but recognition of the profound creativity with which each generation approaches challenges that are simultaneously utterly familiar and completely unique. The patterns repeat, but the responses reveal endless innovation and the persistent hope that understanding itself can transcend the limitations that have constrained previous attempts to achieve lasting resolution. Through this eternal cycle of question and quest, of loss and rediscovery, of destruction and renewal, the deepest truths of existence continue to unfold in forms that honor both the wisdom of the past and the infinite potential that remains forever present in each moment of conscious choice. As we draw these contemplations to their natural rest, we find ourselves enriched by the mysteries we have explored together. The ancient dragons that once filled Hyrule's skies, the lost cities that housed thriving civilizations, the companions whose motives remain forever questioned. All of these speak to truths deeper than simple facts. In the quiet spaces between legend and history, between what we know and what we wonder, lies the eternal appeal of these timeless tales. Each discovery raises new questions. Each answer opens doors to greater mysteries. Perhaps this is the true gift of contemplating such stories, not the resolution of every puzzle, but the expansion of our capacity for wonder. The bones of dragons still rest beneath Hyrule's soil, the ruins of Gorondia still echo with ancient purpose, and somewhere in the realm of possibility, a fairy's true intentions remain shrouded in mystery. These truths will endure long after our musings have ended, waiting patiently for future seekers to uncover their secrets. In this eternal dance between seeker and mystery, questioner and question, we find not endings, but beginnings without number. The patterns that connect all things continue their ancient weaving, inviting us always to look deeper, to wonder more, to discover that every answer is simply a doorway to greater understanding. May your own contemplations carry forward these threads of wonder,